didn't want a baby, so I asked Hubby to open our relationship. His action was brutal.
A simple suggestion led to my husband divorcing me. I didn't end up doing what I was thinking, but I had to pay for it. Maybe I should have given it a deep thought before telling him, and now am being served divorce papers. I never thought that suggesting to open our marriage would not sit well with my husband. I thought he also had the same idea, but I never knew we were far apart. My name is Jessica. I am a 26-year-old fashion designer. The name of my husband is Fred, and he is a 29-year-old banker. My husband and I have been together for 3 years now. My husband and I met at a family function that my mother hosted. I was invited to attend that function since I designed most of the dresses worn by the ladies. I loved my work, and my mother was very proud of me. I didn't exactly like going to those kinds of parties because my mother was always trying to match me with somebody. On that faithful day, I met my husband Fred, talking to my mother, and like every other day, I didn't even look his way. I quickly spoke to my mother and left before she could introduce us. On my way running out of the event at some point, I ran into Gabrielle. Gabrielle was such a lovely woman. I met her through my mother, and I had made some dresses for her. She was always very kind to me, and she supported my work. I respected Gabrielle a lot, and that was why I followed her when she pulled me back into the event. She kept on talking about how her grandson is sweet and all, and at some point I had to tune her out. I thought it was time for me to leave when she pulled me across the hall to where my mother was standing talking to a man. Gabrielle introduced him as his grandson Fred, and at that moment I was very much interested because Fred is a very handsome man. Fred and I got talking, and he told me about what he did for a living, and he complimented me about my work, which I was grateful for. Fred and I exchanged numbers, and from there we started speaking. At that point, I did want to be in a relationship because I had just left one which was not very good. Fred had assured me he was not like every other guy, and I believed him. Fred took me out on dates, which I was very happy with. He was very attentive to me, and I loved that. Things were going smoothly, and at some point Fred asked me to be his girlfriend, and I accepted. I was skeptical about it because I genuinely loved Fred, and I knew he loved me too. While we dated, I discovered that Fred had lost his mother at a very early age, and he was raised by his grandmother, Gabrielle. I got to meet his whole family. His grandmother, who he adored so much, was his everything, and she approved of our relationship. A few months later, Fred and I got married in a very beautiful way. I could say that I was totally in love. We bought a house together and we moved in together. Our marriage was beautiful at some point, and we were the ideal couple. We went out on regular dates, went on vacations, attended so many functions and parties together. Our lives were moving perfectly and felt surreal. Of course, we had different arguments from time to time, but we always found our way back to each other. We didn't really stay mad at each other for long and had our ways of settling each argument. A year into our marriage, things began to change. I started traveling a lot for my work, and I didn't have time. Fred also got promoted, and most times he was not at home. It was as if everything was not in our favor. Whenever I had time to spare before a trip, Fred could be in another state, but we made sure to find time, even if it was an hour in those days, to spend together. It got worse at some point that we didn't see each other for over 6 months. Sure, we talked on the phone and made video calls, but it was different. I was busy creating my designs one day when Gabrielle worked into my office like every other day. I thought it was going to be a very good afternoon with her talking about random things, but it wasn't. I felt like everything started from there. She scolded me about not being present in my marriage and how I was neglecting my house and all. I decided to make her understand that I wasn't neglecting my duties as a wife and that Fred has been busy with work. And she told me that Fred had complained to her that I am no longer available at home and that work had taken most of my time. I was shocked to hear that because it was Fred, who I had not seen in a couple of weeks. I knew we went 6 months without seeing each other, but after that, I decided it was not going to happen again, and I hired more people to work for me in order for me to spend more time with my husband. And so, when Gabrielle was talking to me about what Fred had said, I was disappointed. I made Gabrielle understand what was going on, but she didn't want to see things from my own perspective. I understood how much she meant to Fred, and that's why I decided to let her go on and on about what she didn't really understand. When Gabrielle left, I was so angry because I felt like if by chance Fred and I had issues in our relationship, He shouldn't talk to his grandmother first, but to me, his wife, in order for us to solve the problem. After a few days, Fred returned from his trip, and I decided to talk to him about his grandmother's visit, to which he apologized, and said at that time he didn't know what to do, and we hadn't seen each other for 6 months, and he needed to speak to someone. I understood what he meant, and we decided to resolve our issues and cut back the hours we were working in order for us to have enough time for each other. Fred began to work less, and I also did the same. We started coming back home to each other early. I started cooking dinners for us, we hung out with friends, and it was as if we started dating again. During the next couple of months, we celebrated Fred's birthday. It was celebrated in grand style. I trusted Gabrielle to take such things to the next level. We also invited friends and colleagues. It was indeed beautiful. A year later, and we were back to where things were. We were working more now, and we saw each other. We could only meet during Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, and at that point I felt like we were drifting apart. I hardly saw Fred, which I was not happy about. At some point, I started thinking that maybe he was seeing someone else. I didn't want to think too much into it, and I decided to take my mind off things. I was busy with work when my mother came to visit me. She complained about not seeing me in months, and I had to explain to her that I had been occupied. She had asked about Fred, to which I explained things to her. My mother was a typical housewife who didn't understand the need for a woman to work if her husband was providing for her. That's why she was always responsible for putting together events for my father when he was alive, and that had been her thing today. But I didn't want to be a mere housewife who was responsible for taking care of events. I wanted to make a name for myself. I knew she was not going to understand, so I let it be. Apart from me being in love with Fred at that moment, she contributed to me marrying Fred. She kept going on and on about how I was too successful, and I should be grateful I saw a man who was willing to marry me. I knew she meant well, but that wasn't me. I had always wanted to work for my own money. My mother left my store, and I received a call from Gabrielle saying she would like to see me and my husband Fred in 2 days' time, and that it was very urgent. I didn't know what was going on, and so I said I should call Fred. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew he had been avoiding my calls, but I thought I had given him some heads up concerning what his grandmother had said. I wondered what she could possibly have to tell us. I hoped she was not sick because she meant a lot to Fred and that could break him. I thought to myself, and I didn't know what to do when it was time to go see Gabrielle because I still haven't got hold of Fred. I decided to go there and explain things to her. But on getting there, I saw Fred talking and laughing with his grandmother. I was very shocked. Fred came back and didn't think to return my calls or even come back home. And to make matters worse, he was behaving like we were not having issues in front of his grandmother. That threw me off balance. He was portraying a happy family in front of his grandmother, and we didn't see each other for weeks. I decided to have a talk with him when we were left alone, and he had told me that he didn't want to disappoint his grandmother and that I should play along. I asked him why he ignored my calls and decided not to answer me. I felt at that point Fred had changed. He was not the person I married. I knew we had been busy and all, but that can't possibly drive a rift between us, right? Gabrielle returned, and she sat down and we began talking. Immediately I asked if she was sick, but she responded she wasn't. The reason she called us was because Fred and I had been married for 3 years now without children. I felt taken back. I looked at Fred and he looked indifferent. Before I could understand what was going on, Gabrielle started crying, saying she was getting old and she needed to see her grandchildren before she died. I was about to explain to her that it cannot be possible right now when Fred interrupted me and said, "We could give her what she wants." At that moment, I felt like crying because my husband was not listening to me, and he was promising Gabrielle something we should have discussed as a couple instead of him taking the decision on his own. I looked at Gabrielle and she was very happy. I wanted to speak with Fred, but he left saying he needed to attend to something. Few hours later, I left Gabrielle's house. While I was on my way home, I thought about everything, and I was very sad. I got home and I saw that Fred was at home. I decided to confront him about what had happened, but he said he was going to make his grandmother happy, whether I liked it or not, and I tried to explain to him that We can't bring a child into our midst because we barely had time for ourselves and that a child could complicate things. I told him that we should really explain things to Gabrielle, to which he bluntly refused. Fred seemed not to listen to me at that moment. All he cared about was how to grant his grandmother wishes and also to make her happy. I'm not against birthing a child, not at all. I just didn't want my child to lack attention from us. And also, I didn't want my child to be left in the hands of a nanny. The fact that Fred didn't understand me at that moment made me very upset, and we ended up in a heated argument. He didn't see things from my own perspective, and I think I also didn't understand where he was coming from. Yes, every couple would literally want to have a child, but in our case, we barely had time for each other, and so bringing in a child at that time was a very bad idea. Truly, I wasn't ready to quit my job, and so also Fred wasn't ready either. I didn't have a problem working, but I have a problem staying at home doing nothing. I didn't want to be a full-time housewife that would always stay at home watching TV and doing house chores. I'm not trying to condemn those that are full-time housewives. Honestly, it is not a bad thing to be a full-time housewife, but that life is not for me. I love my career with passion, and I like putting a smile on my clients' faces. I wanted to also put a smile on Gabriella and my family. But it seemed like I wasn't doing enough, because I literally did try to make them happy, most especially Gabriella. Weeks went by, and Gabriella constantly reminded us about wanting to see her grandchildren. And so one day, I called my husband and told him that we really need to settle this issue of having a child. Of course, he didn't feel the heat like I had felt back then because everyone thought I was the problem. Fred was guilty, in fact, we both were guilty, but he made it look as if I was the problem. So Fred and I talked on the phone, and I asked him if he would be home the coming weekend so we could patch things out. He told me to give him about 30 minutes so that he could get back to me and that he was in a meeting. I agreed, and we ended the call. After getting off the phone with my husband, I picked my bag and headed home. It was time for me to close for the day, so I went home and hoped that my husband would keep to his promise and return the call. I arrived home and met an empty house as usual. I had my shower and changed into my pajamas. I was about heading to the kitchen to fix something for dinner when my husband called. He apologized for not keeping to the time. We asked ourselves how our day went, and I asked about the meeting he had that day, if everything went okay, and he responded positively. I asked him if he could come back that weekend so we could talk things out, most especially the child aspect. And he assured me that he was going to come. We talked about a few things on the phone before we ended the call. I went ahead and had my dinner and watched my regular TV night shows before I retired to bed for the night. World Cup the next day very early and headed home. Apparently, one of my good clients had booked to be styled for a photo shoot, so I left home before 5 a.m. I went to the client house with my crew members and all the equipment we needed to carry out our job. It was a birthday photo shoot, and we needed to deliver effectively. At the photo shoot, I met my old schoolmate, Becca. I was a year older than Becca, and also a year ahead of her when we were in college. It was a mutual friendship, and Becca seemed calm back then in school. I asked her what she was doing in the studio, and she said the lady I was styling at that moment was her cousin's sister. She just came around to her cousin's sister with a couple of things. She also told me that she had no idea that I was the stylist that always styled her cousin. She complimented on my style of fashion and hoped to be like me someday. I felt so happy, and at that moment I was very proud of myself for being able to put this through all by myself. It was a proud moment for me, guys. LOL. Becca and I chatted for a long time while I left my crew members to work. I usually left my clients with my crew members because I also wanted them to learn. And so, I gave them a chance to represent me, which they often deliver effectively. Becca and I talked a lot about school, businesses, and personal life. I really enjoyed conversing with Becca. I was so engrossed in the conversation that I literally forgot what I came there to do at first. I also showed her the work I had done and a few other things. And so, guys, I really had a nice time with Becca. 30 minutes later, we all were set to leave and bade ourselves farewell. Becca and exchanged contacts and got in touch with each other. I and my crew members headed straight to the store and continued our daily routine. It was at that time my phone rang, and it was my husband calling. He called to tell me that he would be coming back home the next day. I got off the phone and continued with what I was doing. So, guys, the next morning, I didn't go to work because it was on a Saturday. I don't normally work on weekends because I decided to limit my workload. That day, my husband was expected to come back home, and so I waited for him. Few hours later, Fred arrived home, and I welcomed him as usual. I wanted him to have a rest before telling him what I had in mind. He went and freshened up, and a few minutes later, he came down to have lunch. I went to the sitting room to continue watching my movie. Fred later came over to where I was seated and asked me what was so important that I had to call him over to discuss. He told me he was curious to know, and he paid attention to me. At that moment, I didn't know how to put it out to him because I'd gotten so furious. Somehow I mustered the courage and told him we should open up our marriage since we barely see each other or spend time together. We would still be a couple, and our families don't need to know about it. I also told him I wasn't ready to have a child just yet because we both don't have time, and I wasn't ready to be a full-time mom. I wanted to concentrate more on my career until I was ready. Immediately I said that. Fred yelled at me and almost gave me a slap. He was shocked and at the same time looked at me in utmost disgust. I saw through his eyes that he was really disappointed in me. Fred left my side and went inside the room. In that state of anger, Fred broke a lot of valuables and even broke our wedding pictures. I tried to calm him down, but he didn't listen. I ran out of the house because I didn't want Fred to harm me. So guys, I told Fred about my suggestion and he got really mad. I haven't seen Fred that mad ever since we were together. Maybe I woke up the beast in him. Update. Hi guys, I have gone through all of you guys' comments and I really appreciate it. I have also seen the hateful comments and truly, I deserve all of that. Let me get straight to the point. So guys, I ran out of the house in fear because I had never seen my husband that mad before. I went to my mom's house to explain what had happened. Honestly, she was really disappointed in me. I explained to her about how Fred and I weren't that couple we always portrayed whenever we were in the family gathering. At that point, she didn't stop reminding me of how she was irritated by my own foolish suggestion. The following day, I got a call from Gabrielle. At that point, I already knew that my husband had already told her about it. I couldn't pick the phone because I was very ashamed of myself. I got up that morning with swollen eyes. Apparently, I had cried all through the night after thinking about what I had suggested to my husband. I thought he also wanted to open it up since things were not like before. So I didn't pick the call and didn't return it back either. It had been 10 hours since I had left home, and my husband didn't call me. He switched his lines so I wouldn't be able to reach out to him. Just when I was about to leave the bed, I got a knock on my door. I didn't answer, and after a while, the person opened the door and came in. It was my mom. She sat down on the bed and told me Fred had sent something for me. I got up in the hope that maybe he wanted to see me. I got curious as to why he had to send me a package. I opened it and found out that it was divorce papers. I couldn't believe my eyes. My mom hugged me and patted me to stop crying. The divorce papers were already signed by Fred. I was left to sign it. My husband knew I would come see him after seeing the divorce papers, and so he traveled out of town that very day. He instructed our family lawyer to come back the next day to collect the papers after I had signed it. So, 2 days later after Fred left town, I signed the divorce papers and handed it over to the lawyer. It was a tough decision, but I had to make it because there was nothing I could do to change his mind. Update. Guys, it has already been months since my husband and I both went our separate ways. I moved out of my mom's house and managed to get a place to stay. I didn't want to go back and start staying with her. I wanted to be independent and have my own place. Fred moved on, and he never spoke to me since the last time I ran out of the house. I also have moved on with my life. I want to try and put my life together and also try out new things. Most times, I usually go to my store and get myself busy so as to make me forget all that has happened in the last few months. Gabrielle never called back ever since I ignored her call. I know I must have really hurt her, but I guess she wouldn't want to see my face again. So guys, this is my story. I hope you all have learned something from this. I hope none of you would make the same mistake I made. I should have never told my husband that. I guess this was a lesson well learned.
Really, some people don't really know when to stop fooling themselves, thinking that if they get married to a girl with an afforded father or any parent, they would somehow also inherit what our parents leave for us. You know, they should be ashamed of themselves to even think that they would get any share in our parents' inheritance. I thought I had found the one who would be with me and by my side all the time, but who was I fooling? Because the person I had thought was my life partner was actually my life stealer. But it's really nice playing dumb to a person who thought they were smart. You know, I hate it when someone acts like they love you and look at you like you are the only thing that mattered to them when in front of your family, but be someone else when in your own space. I mean, why pretend to be someone you are not when you know exactly why you came into my life? I respect honest people. You know, a person who would tell straight up that, you know what, I'm with you for the benefits that you are coming with. Well, my husband showed me and showered me with so much love, care and sweet affection for the whole 5 years. Well, I think he showed me all that side of him because he respected my father. You know why I'm saying that? It was because my father was a feared man in Ohio. That was where I grew up. He was my father's personal assistant, PA. My father was a private cardiothoracic surgeon. He had his own private practice. I don't know why my father trusted my ex-husband so much, but he did trust up until he realized the real person he was. So what advice can you give a person who was almost scammed by her own loving husband, a father of her children? I mean, the person knew how to be an actor, but little did he know that there is a difference between a qualified and good actress and an actor wannabe. I must say that I was fortunate that I was able to learn about people's body languages and to know when they are pretending to be real, all thanks to my father and my acting academy. My name is Miranda, female, 30 years, but my father used to call me Mimi, and my husband, or let me say my ex-husband, is Richard, male, 35 years, we met at home. I don't know if you will understand if I say it like that. Well, Richard had come to my house to deliver some documents that my father needed because he was working at home that day since my mother was not feeling well. He came to our house and asked where my father was. I didn't answer him at first because I had just zoned out the time I opened the door for him. I think he saw that I had zoned out and he just let himself in. That was when I managed to bring my mind back to reality. I was charmed by his handsomeness, his body posture, the way he dressed. One would swear he was a model or something, and not to mention when he opened his mouth, I just melted and zoned out on the spot. So I followed him and told him that my father was busy, but he could leave whatever he had brought to me, of which he refused and told me that he needed to give them to my father. Luckily, father came down and took the documents that he had, then he introduced us. That time I was 24 years old and he was 29, I think. Father saw the way I was looking at Richard and told me to stay away from him and should focus at school, not on boys. I first didn't understand why my father would say that, but with my stubborn self I didn't listen. Instead, I would go to my father's practice and pretend like I was going to check on my father whenever I came from school, knowing very well that sometimes my father would work at home because he didn't want to leave my mother alone and he didn't want any helper. Knowing very well that I was actually looking for Richard. He noticed that when I had come maybe for like 3 times at my father's practice, pretending to be looking for him while knowing that he was home taking care of my mother. He asked why I kept coming to the office while I knew that my father was working from home. I told him that I didn't know that he was at home. I thought he had come to work to operate on someone, maybe, because he would only go to work if there was a patient that needed his special operation and their condition was serious. I knew that he didn't believe my lie, but I didn't care because I wouldn't tell a guy that I had come to see them. So the guy just suggested that I should give him my contact numbers so he can tell me when my father would be available so that I won't keep coming to the office for nothing. I didn't ask him many questions, I just gave him my numbers, and he gave me a call later that day saying he was just checking up on me. My heart was filled with so much joy when he called. Since then he kept checking up on me either through calls or text messages. We became pretty close, well, privately, because we didn't want my father to find out that I was a friend of his personal assistant since he had warned me to stay away from him. You know how us girls get when we are told to stay away from someone or trouble, we just don't listen and go to the trouble or someone we had been warned about, thinking that what your father told you was not true. We always want to prove our parents wrong by their speculations. But I guess mine was not wrong after all, and I regretted not listening to him. Anyway, a couple of months as Richard and I kept spending time together, we got closer and closer until I knew that I had developed feelings for the guy. I mean, he was treating me like a princess. He wouldn't go a day without checking up on me, taking me out every week and fetching me from school. Richard became my friend, my source of happiness. I was happy with him, I won't lie, and he would always manage to make my dull day gloomy without trying so hard. The more we spent time together, the more I saw him as a person who I wished to spend my life and have children with. He was funny, loving, caring, and very supportive, so you wouldn't fall for a person like that. He gave me so much attention. He once told me that he was born in Chicago and moved to Broadview Hills here in Ohio after his family was gunned down by some gangsters. His story was really heartbreaking, but despite everything I loved about him, he told me that he wasn't perfect and I should expect that he might make mistakes along the way, but that won't mean he didn't love me. 6 or 7 months later, I don't remember well, he proposed. I had told my father that I was dating him and he didn't approve of our relationship, but he had no choice but to accept things as they were because a heart knows what it wants, right, and it wants Richard. We got married during summer holidays after my graduation at Howard School of Acting. My father was not really okay with me getting married at 25, but I made him understand that the decision I had taken was what my heart wanted. Things were great between us, our marriage was what I can say a dream marriage life, he was perfect, we were perfect, you know, I didn't even get any doubt feeling about us, I had thought we were going to spend our whole lives together, but I guess life always has other plans for everyone, right? My mother had recovered, meaning my father had gone back to be hands-on with his practice. A year later after our marriage, we were still very much in love and the love grew more and more, especially when we discovered that I was pregnant. We were so happy, you know, my heart still bleeds when I think of how much hope and faith I had put into that marriage, only for it to just end like it had never even started. It went down the drain like ashes being washed away by the sea. 9 months later I gave birth to the most precious and beautiful twins. I was so happy and in so much love with them. That time I knew I had been blessed with everything in life. I mean, I had the most loving, supportive, and caring husband, and the most beautiful babies. What more would I have asked for? About 2 or 3 years later, Richard started changing. He would go out a lot, saying he was going out with his friends, and came back home very late. I knew his knockoff time since he was working for my father. Well, my father eventually accepted him as his son-in-law and he allowed him to continue being his assistant because he trusted him, even though it wasn't fully, but he did trust him. The children would always complain that their daddy was no longer spending much time with them, and that would always break my heart because I didn't know what lie I would tell my children. I tried addressing that issue with Richard and begged him to at least show some love and attention to children because they were noticing that their father had changed. And to their little smart minds, they thought their daddy didn't love them anymore. Only if I knew that the bastard was actually on a mission to destroy my family and take away my rights. He promised to change and told me a lame and lousy excuse that my father was giving him so much work, so that was why he would come back late, because he didn't want any destruction and would leave the office before he gets done with everything. He became the father that my children wanted for a couple of weeks until he changed and went back to his old self. I didn't know what to do anymore, so I told my father what had been happening in my marriage. I had a glimpse of hope that my father would be able to get through to him and become the husband to me and a father to our children, since Richard respected my father, as he said he was, or pretended to be respectful towards my father. I gave all my hope to my father, but the man didn't change everything that he was doing, he made them worse, from coming home very late and going out a lot with his friends. He became the person I didn't know and couldn't recognize. He was no longer coming back home, and came back home with a lousy excuse that he had slept at his friend's house. They had a lot to drink, so he ended up spending the night there. So as a qualified actress, I had learned about people's postures and body languages. I knew when a person was lying, and Richard was lying straight to my face. After some time, I saw that there was no change in his behavior. I took my children to my parents' house, not because I wanted to try and fix my marriage with Richard, but I wanted to find out about his behavior. My conscience was telling me that he was doing something that he knew I wouldn't approve of, or something that would jeopardize our marriage. Cheating was the first thing that came to my mind when he started going out a lot and not coming back home or even trying to spend some time with our children. Something was definitely off with him, and I knew I needed to find out what it was. Weeks passed and I saw that Richard was not changing his behavior, so I got a private investigator. I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was doing something that would definitely jeopardize our marriage. Things got too bad to a point that I was no different than single mothers. My husband was there, but he was not there. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. Everything was just too much for me to bear. The children were so handful and would sometimes ask for their father, and I had to lie for him every single day. You know the pain of having to lie to your children, telling them that their father was busy at work even when you know deep down that he knocks off early and goes to wherever he spends most of his time with whoever he was spending time with. I loved my husband, but what he was doing to me was really what I never signed up for, and I needed to know what he was getting up to before I jumped into conclusions. I didn't even want to tell my parents about my marital problems until I knew what had been happening with the person I had married. A private investigator got back to me after some time of waiting, and the things he found out were really heartbreaking. I just couldn't believe that the Richard, the man I loved and married, was actually the very same man who was plotting on destroying and betraying the person who helped him. I also found out the most criminating things he once did in Chicago before he moved to Ohio. It's so funny when someone acts all holy in front of you and your family and his very own children while they know very well what they are actually capable of. So in my research, or the things that the PI had discovered about Richard were really shocking. They made me think deeply about our marriage. I mean, the way he was acting was telling me another thing about him and showed me another side of him that I had never thought I would actually see. I have heard of scammers on social media and those broadcasting channels like radio and TV, but I had never thought I would actually date, marry, and have kids with one of the scammers. Few weeks later, I decided to keep things to myself. I mean, I already knew his dark plans, and I decided to let the dumb one think they are smart. Despite the love that I had for Richard, I mean, there was no doubt that I loved him, and to my surprise, I still love him, you know. But it was really hard to be sure that he also loved me, or he was using me to get what he wanted. To achieve all his scamming tendencies. I gave him easy access to myself and looked at what happened. I became a bait in his dark scamming shenanigans. I protected him, thinking he was going to change and become the person that he was when we first met. I regret ever stooping so low and lowering myself just because I had a crush on the guy. My father had warned me to stay away from him, but I didn't listen. Instead, I fell harder for the guy. I did everything to prove that he was mine and he was perfect for me to my father, so he can accept him as his son-in-law, not only as his personal assistant. But guess where all that had put me and my family? One thing I will forever be grateful for that Richard had given me would be my children. You know, on that one he gave me the most precious and priceless gift ever. I don't regret loving him because till today I still have some feelings for him, but I regret being the one who approached him as a cheap and easy woman. He took that as an advantage and used me to get what he wanted. It took me a very long time to realize that I was actually being played, but guess who won at the end? About a year later, I came back from an acting audition. I received a call from my mother telling me that my father had got involved in a car accident when he just left his workplace to go home. At that time, Richard had come back being the best husband and father to me and our children. As much as he was trying, I was happy, but I couldn't trust him anymore. You know, staying in one house and sharing one bed with someone you do not trust is a very dangerous and poisonous pill to take. So when I was still conducting an investigation about my husband, I changed a lot of things to my children's names, including all my assets. I didn't know what he would do to me to get all the things that I had worked hard for and my savings that I had saved from my father. When my mother told me about my father's accident, I couldn't stay in the house any longer, and my mind and conscience was telling me that Richard would somehow be involved in what happened to my father. Some would ask why I was still staying in a marriage that had no trust. Honestly, I don't know why I stayed. My heart wanted to stay because I loved him. Secondly, I wanted my children to grow up in a home with both parents, you know. That is why I said I sacrificed my happiness and my peace to keep my marriage intact. So the man of the house just pretended to feel sympathy for me. I just didn't understand why. And there is something that he said when he was consoling me and hugging me that I realized later, and it was evident that he actually had a hand in my father's accident. Later on, the doctor came to us and told me that my father wanted to speak to me. I didn't know why he wanted to speak to me, instead of fighting and going back home to mom, but I went to his ward. And what he told me was what I had already known about Richard being a scammer, but what surprised me was when he told me that he had a plan to terminate my father, then take over everything he had worked hard for. He told me that during his own research he found out that Richard actually had a fiancée back in Chicago whom he left her pregnant and came here to make money or to scam more people so he can go back to his hometown and take his fiancée and relocate to another state. So Richard found out about what my father had discovered, so he tampered with my father's car tires because my father wanted to take the evidence he had found and take it to the OPD, Ohio Police Department. That was when my father got into that accident. My father's last words before he closed his eyes for the last time were, "Please make sure that you take good care of my assets, my practice, and everything, because your greedy and manipulative husband had tried to trick me to sign off everything including my house to him." Luckily, I had already called my lawyer to change everything and asked for a fake form similar to the one that Richard wanted to trick him with and signed it. Meaning that Richard thought he had one, but he didn't do his research and he was the dumbest person I had ever come across, though I still had some love for him. So after an hour of speaking to my father, he also spoke to his wife, who was the last person to speak to him. When we left the hospital, my mother was no longer the same. She was broken, which was understandable. But I admired Dad's bravery and last fight to be able to speak his last words and warn me about Richard. He had always been warning me, but I was too blinded by love to a point that I didn't even see when I was putting myself in danger. The passing of my father made me somehow feel like everything was my fault. I mean, if I had listened to him, surely he would still be alive. I lived with the guilt for months, but it didn't help me. Instead, it drove me to the depression state. So on the day of my father's funeral, Richard had been the most loving, caring, and supportive husband ever. Not that I didn't appreciate his love and support, but whenever I looked at him, I would think of my father's words. I had developed some love and hate for my husband. I was no longer comfortable and free around him. Is that even normal? So after my father's funeral, my father's lawyer had already told us that my father had changed his will. The family gathered at my childhood home, a charming Victorian house that held years of cherished memories. So during the reading of the will, my father's legal representative announced that I had gotten a house and a 50% share of all his assets, of which the other 50 would be left with Mom. Since we were a small family, it was fair what my father had left for us. When the lawyer mentioned the house, I saw Richard smirking. I didn't understand why he was doing that, but I knew that he thought he had one. After the reading of the will, Richard and I, along with the kids, went back to our house. Right after we had entered the house, he told me that he wanted to speak to me about something, and then he asked me how I felt. I got really confused at first because he knew that I had lost a parent and he had the nerve to ask how I was feeling. Obviously, I was heartbroken, shuddered, angry, and everything. He continued by asking how I felt about the fact that he took my father's house that I had inherited. I just acted dumb and asked him what he was talking about. So he told me that the house my father had left for me, or thought he had left for me, was his. My eyes widened in disbelief, and a moment of silence hung in the air. Then, unexpectedly, I burst into laughter. I just couldn't help it, because I had thought he was going to change his statement and say he was joking, but he wasn't. I didn't know that my husband would stoop so low and want to take over someone else's house. It was just hilarious. I continued laughing at him until his face changed from a smirk to red. What he had told me was just so funny to me because I knew the truth. Richard looked at me, perplexed by my reaction. He got confused by my sudden outburst laugh, which made him look like a fool, and got angry. He unleashed his true colors, the rage that was visible in his eyes. He told me that he was serious and he had legal documents that stated that the house was his and it was his right. I just couldn't believe him, so I just said okay, even though I knew it wasn't okay. I saw a different side of him, and it was somehow scary because I didn't know what he would do either to me or the kids or even my mother, since he became so obsessed with taking my inherited house. He became a whole different person, and I really thought of the worst, but instead he just went away to only God knew where he went to. A week later, reality started kicking in. I was in so much denial that my father was no more. I wouldn't mention the state my mother was in. It was heartbreaking to see her drowning in depression like that. I had thought I would lose her also. Everything was just overwhelming and too much to bear. I missed and needed my father and his advice, but the bastard that I had married decided to act God in my father's life. The house was in so much peace without him in the house, even though the kids asked about him, but I would tell them that he had gone to a business trip. I was not okay, my heart was not okay. I wanted to be there for my mother, but I didn't know how to because I was also in denial of my father's passing. I was going through the grieving process. I had even become distant to my own children and thanked their minder for agreeing to be a stay-at-home nanny because I knew I wouldn't know. I mean, one side I was dealing with the fact that my beloved and caring husband was actually with me for his own selfish benefits, while on the other side I felt like I had failed my father. I had evidence and long knew what Richard had been up to, but I chose to keep quiet and have faith that Richard would change and be the husband that I had fallen in love with and married. The father of my kids, but where did that get me? It took my father away from me, it stole my children's granddad and my mother's husband. I couldn't help but feel guilty about everything. I let my heart lead me astray. I should have listened to my mind and conscience, but no, I used my love for him to hide the selfish behavior that my husband was plotting against my father. Weeks passed. I think about 2 or 3 weeks passed. Richard came back home and it was somehow awkward to be in his presence. I didn't know how to act around him, though the kids were happy to have their father back home. The following days were filled with tense discussions and legal consultations. Richard had suggested that and I agreed to prove him wrong. I was determined to uncover the truth behind my father's will. Though I knew the truth, while Richard was also sure that the house was his, I had no power and energy to fight over my father's house, but I had to think of my mother. So one day I went home to check if my father had left any letters or a title deed maybe. As I delved into my father's personal effects, I stumbled upon a series of heartfelt letters he had written to me that even my mother didn't even know of. These letters detailed his unwavering love for me and his desire for my happiness. I knew my father loved me, but I didn't know it was that deep. Till today, I would read them whenever I feel like I miss my father. They make me emotional every time I read them. Anyway, I went home, armed with this newfound evidence. I confronted Richard once again. This time, my laughter had transformed into a calm resolve. I handed him the letters, my eyes glistening with determination. So I told him that I knew that he was trying to claim what he thought was rightfully his, but these letters proved otherwise. My father's love for me was unconditional, and the house was his gift to me. So I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me no matter what. Richard read the letters in silence, his face turning pale with realization. The truth had finally dawned on him, and he felt a deep sense of guilt for doubting my inheritance. After he saw that his lies and deceit didn't work out as he thought it would, he started acting all remorse and apologizing. I didn't buy his apology. I knew it was not genuine and truthful because I had found out the truth about him and his past. He told me how sorry he was and that he had let his own desires blind him to a point that he was driven by his greediness and couldn't use his mind. As much as I was angry at him and didn't trust him, I thought of every good thing he had done for me, plus my love for him couldn't let me get angry at him for a long time. I know my father had warned me about him and I had also found out about his past, but I needed him, our kids needed him, so I somehow forgave him and gave him another chance in our lives. From that day on, Richard and I worked together to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. We even transformed the house into a sanctuary of love and laughter, where our bond grew stronger with each passing day. Though my heart had its own doubts, I gave him the benefit of it. And so, in the face of adversity, my laughter became a symbol of my resilience and unwavering spirit. I had learned to find humor even in the most challenging of situations, reminding myself and those around me that life's obstacles could be overcome with love, understanding, and a touch of laughter. We decided to start a couples therapy, which was going to help us regain our trust and bring back the love we once shared. We wanted our children to grow up in a home full of love and happiness. I had faith that everything would work out for us and we would become a happy family again. Even though my mother was not approving that I was fixing things with Richard, and I understood her fears, but I loved the guy and there was nothing I could do about it, and besides, my kids needed both their parents under one roof. I know I acted like a fool and a naive girl, but I had faith in Richard. So one good sunny day my husband had decided to take us to a mini vacation as a family, and guess what happened? His fiancée, the one from Chicago, came to our house early in the morning looking for Richard. She came guns blazing ready to fight. Luckily Richard was there to sort out his issues with his fiancée/baby mama, or whatever that she was. I didn't want any more drama in my life, so I excused them and left them staring at each other in the kitchen. That day we ended up canceling our mini vacation because Richard suddenly had an uninvited visitor. To say I was angry would be an understatement. I was beyond angry. I was hurt, shattered, frustrated, and everything that a person would feel when they find out that the reality or the secret that you have been trying to avoid for a very long time is actually coming to reality. We even tried to fix things, but all that had gone in vain. It was like we didn't even try anything. I just went home. I couldn't be in the same house with Richard's fiancée, and I was regretting my decision of forgiving him. I hated everything that had his name. I had thought we were going on the right path, but clearly we were not. So as I was home, my mother had already fired Richard from my father's practice after she found out what he had done to my father, which was why she didn't want me to fix things with him. I just don't know why I do not listen to my parents whenever they warn me, because I always get harsh karma for not listening. 2 weeks later, I had filed for a divorce and for a restraining order because Richard kept calling me and coming to my family home acting all psycho to a point that even the kids got scared of him. I also handed over the evidence that I had discovered during my investigation. Luckily, the investigation regarding my father's accident was still ongoing, so it was easy to bring Richard down. If his fiancée didn't come to our house and ruined our family vacation, I was not going to be so angry and seek revenge. I was so hurt. Another thing I felt was regrets. I regretted everything and I found myself blaming myself for everything, including my father's passing. I needed him to pay for the pain he had caused my mother, and I managed to do all that. But whenever I was alone in my bedroom, I would look at our wedding pictures and my family pictures, then I would just break down. I went through a very tough depression phase for almost a year, and I had thought I was going to lose my life in the process. Everything was too much for me to handle. But there was one thing I was proud of that I had done, and that was saving my father's house and assets from the greedy and selfish bastard. My mother found me a therapist that did house calls, and I was grateful for that because I didn't want to face the world. I was somehow scared that Richard would see me or temper with my car tires, also like he did to my father. I couldn't leave my kids alone. The therapy sessions went on for months, because sometimes I would not want to open up, but I eventually got help and decided to stand up for myself. Richard was sentenced to 25 years in prison for murder and another 25 years for scamming a businessman in Chicago, and other charges came up when the police continued with the investigation. I was so relieved that he was finally away from me and my family, and I had vowed to never ever think I know better. I vowed to listen to my mother whenever she gives me warnings. After Richard got sentenced, I became free again. I became myself and decided to take my acting career seriously. After that, I never went back to my matrimonial house. I continued staying with my mother, and our lives were in so much peace and happiness. I realized that I didn't know what peace and happiness was when I was with Richard because I was blinded by the love I had for him, but now I can proudly say I am free and at peace. Please tell me if the decisions I had taken and made were good moves. Half of my heart still loves the guy, but the other hates him with passion. My children sometimes want to visit him in jail, but I do not allow them because I do not want anything to do with Richard. What should I do? Please tip me here because I am lost and I don't know what to do.